and then we get you some more water. Maybe not put it in that way. Okay, let's try this again. Take two. Yes. Dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, our speaker this evening, Dr. Diane Bolger, has been involved in Cypriot archaeology for quite some time, I'm not going to say how much, and is one of the leading authorities in the Cypriot Chalcolithic, in the study of ceramics of this period, and is usually the first scholar who springs to mind when discussing gender and prehistoric archaeology. She has been one of the key members of the University of Edinburgh's field projects in Western Cyprus, together with the late and much missed Professor Edgar Peltenberg, has excavated and published the sites of Lemba, Gisonerga, and Suskiu, which is coming soon. Diane studied classics at the University of Pennsylvania and then did her PhD at the University of Cincinnati. She received a postdoctoral fellowship from the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, the DAAD, to work at the University of Erlangen in Nuremberg in Germany. She has also worked as a lecturer and as a professor for the University of Maryland, the European Division in Heidelberg from 2002. And from 2002, she has been working as a research fellow at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. Diane has published many papers on ceramics and gender and has edited a series of books on the same subject. In 2003, she published a book entitled Gender in Ancient Cyprus, Narratives of Social Change on a Mediterranean Island. In the last few years, Diane was working together with Eddie Peltenberg and Lindy Crew on the final publications of the excavations at the site of Suskiu-Laona. Sadly, this is a task she now has to finish together with Lindy and other members of the team, such as our own Hari Paraskeva. The title of the monograph will be Figurine Makers of Prehistoric Cyprus, Settlement and Cemeteries at Suskiu. Tonight, she will speak to us about another subject close to her heart. The title of her lecture is Identities and Materialities in Prehistoric Cyprus, Evidence of Foreign Cultural Interaction Before the Bronze Age. Diana.
Thank you very much, Lina, and thank you to all of you for coming this evening. It's great to be back here in Nicosia after what seems like a long period of exile in the Paphos district. I think it's been a while since I've given a talk here, so let's get started. Evidence from excavations over the last few decades suggests that Cyprus was inhabited initially by small groups of hunter-gatherers around 10,000 BC and colonized more extensively in the middle of the 9th millennium when migratory groups from the Levantine mainland traveled to the island to establish the first farming communities. By the time of settlement at Kyriakia, several millennia later, these communities had become more isolated from their mainland counterparts and had started to follow their own developmental course. While archaeologists have traditionally regarded the early Bronze Age as the time when the island began to re-engage with other regions of the Eastern Mediterranean, investigations at several sites in the southwest of the island suggest a more complex scenario, with evidence of renewed episodes of foreign interaction, perhaps as early as the late 4th millennium. Changes in material culture at this time, most importantly the adoption of new pottery technologies and the manufacture and use of personal ornaments in new shapes and materials, can be linked to the island's renewed contact with surrounding mainland and to the transformation of various aspects of personal and social identity. Now, you'll be grateful to hear that I'm not going to be talking about all of the periods shown in this slide. My focus is going to be on the two that are in red type, so the Middle and the Late Chalcolithic. In a series of articles published over the last 10 years by myself and Eddie Peltenberg, and in a recent doctoral dissertation by Harlambos Paraskeva, the focus of research has shifted to the Middle and Late Chalcolithic periods in order to trace the trajectory of these changes, and to understand more fully the transformations taking place on the island that ultimately led to the emergence of Bronze Age society later in the 3rd millennium. As a result, greater attention is now being paid to the complex interactions observable in the material cultural record, particularly of ceramics, personal ornamentation, and metallurgy of the Middle and Late Chalcolithic periods, particularly in the southwest of the island, where there is well-stratified evidence from a number of settlement and cemetery sites. So my focus will be on the sites there that are circled in red. Changes in ceramic technology and personal ornamentation at these sites show links between the island and the surrounding mainland well before the start of the early Bronze Age. While a macro-scale approach is important for observing these social and economic transformations over the longue durée of the 4th to 3rd millennia BC, it's equally important to focus on smaller-scale differences at contemporary sites, even among closely spaced sites within the same region, like these three here in southwest of Cyprus. Consequently, this paper focuses on evidence from these sites in order to gain a more nuanced understanding of the various ways that particular Chalcolithic communities engaged with those of the surrounding regions and reconfigured their personal and social identities during this critical period of the island's prehistory. In many respects, the Chalcolithic period of Cyprus can be regarded as a continuation from the late Neolithic period, since both comprise small-scale egalitarian farming communities, intramural burial practices, and lithic technologies. As in the Neolithic, Chalcolithic houses were made of stone, earth, and timbers, and they were predominantly circular in plan, as you can see on the left hand of this slide. Lemba above and Casonergomophilia below. Experimental work in the area adjacent to the archaeological site in the village of Lemba, shown at the right, gives some idea of how these buildings may have been constructed and how they may have looked in 3 dimensions and how quickly they decayed over time. The largest one is now under reconstruction, and so after approximately a generation, it's more or less falling apart. Standard burial practices during the Chalcolithic likewise show continuity with the Neolithic. These consist of single articulated inhumations in small pits, positioned in and around the buildings within the settlement. The only known exception to this rule occurs at the extramural cemeteries of Souskiou, seen here on the left, where burials occur as multiple interments anticipating those of the Cypriot Bronze Age. Such as the picture to the right of the slide from Venus. When group burials in large extramural cemeteries become standard practice. And just to give you an idea, those of you that may not know, so just a few more pictures of what these graves or tombs look like. These are plans and sections on the left from excavations that we did with the Department of Antiquities, published in 2006 from Vatakakas. And at the right, Sharon Taylor's eldest son, Aries, in a deep bell pit when he was just a child, probably violating all health and safety rules at the time. Anyway, those are those. And also, just to give you an idea of what we've been finding at Laona, where we have many more human remains that have been recovered and have been carefully excavated. So this is what the burials are looking like there. While ceramic technology was not new to Cyprus at this time, having been introduced during the late Neolithic period, it undergoes significant stylistic and pyrotechnic developments during the Chalcolithic period, as evidenced by the lively painted pots of Middle Chalcolithic red-on-white ware shown in the top row here, and the more standardized, higher-fired monochrome wares of the late Chalcolithic, shown at the bottom. And of these late Chalcolithic pots, their shape, surfaces, and firing techniques have strong affinities with pottery wares from early Bronze Age Anatolia. The Chalcolithic period also furnishes the earliest known evidence for metalworking on the island. Those from our recent excavations at Laona being among the earliest known examples. And I'd like to interject here a big thank you to Lena and to Andreas Haralambos for allowing me to talk about some of the results prior to their publication. Most metal objects of the Middle Chalcolithic period can be regarded as personal ornaments, although a few possible tool fragments have been found. In contrast, late Chalcolithic metal objects identifiable to type appear to be tools, especially chisels, although admittedly the number of finds is very small, and until very recently there's been no compelling evidence for the importation of metals or metalworking technology from abroad at this time, but more on that later. There's some exciting new evidence for that. In fact, it's possible that the opposite was the case. Excavations at the early Bronze I cemetery of Ayafotia in Crete, that dates to about 3000 BC, have produced 2 daggers, a fishhook, and an awl made of copper with a likely Cypriot source. And chemical, metallographic, and lead isotope analyses on an EB2 copper axe from Pella in Jordan, published in 2003 by Graham Phillip and colleagues, indicate that it was made of arsenical copper, very likely derived from the Troodos Mountains. On the basis of this evidence, together with the higher early Bronze Age chronology that is being proposed now by the Southern Levant Arcane Group, which has effectively redated the EB2 of the South Levant to the early centuries of the 3rd millennium, Stephen Bork has argued that dates for the Cypriot Early Bronze Age, in particular for the Philia phase, should likewise be revised upwards, thereby synchronizing the Philia with the early 3rd millennium copper axe from Pella. But, and there's a big but, additional evidence is needed to support this view, and it's absolutely essential that we dissociate the earliest evidence of foreign cultural interaction during the Chalcolithic period at sites like Lemberg, Osanaga, and Suskiu from that of the Philia horizon, which happened later and is likely to have had a greater impact on sites in the north of the island where archaeological investigation has not been possible since 1974. Far more numerous than metal objects are the many figurines and pendants for which the Chalcolithic period is best known. This large corpus of materials includes figurines, pendants, and anthropomorphic vessels in a variety of materials, including stone, bone, shell, and pottery. Traditional interpretations of these artifacts as mother goddesses or precursors to the goddess Aphrodite have largely been abandoned in recent years and reinterpreted within the framework of gender research. Analysis of the entire corpus of material indicates a variety of gender categories, including males and females, as well as a significant number of dual-sexed and ambiguous examples. So, for example, you can see, while these may be arguably female, this is definitely, well, the head and neck seem to be male and the rest of the body female, so we would call that a dual-sexed example. And all along the bottom are clear examples of male figurines, so we definitely have a variety of gender groups here. More ambiguous, perhaps, are the pendants, because obviously there's not as much detail as there is on the figurines, but a lot of these can be, some of these can be sex, but a lot of them are actually what we would call ambiguous gender categories. Contextual evidence and useware analysis suggests that figurines and pendants may have played important roles in communal life cycle rituals such as birth, death, and puberty. Since one of the largest and most detailed ceramic examples shows a woman in the act of giving birth, some of them might be interpreted as birthing figures. In general, however, the multiplicity of forms, materials, fine contexts, and wear patterns associated with these objects suggests a variety of meanings and functions and underscores the degree to which they formed an integral part of Chalcolithic society as a whole. The most frequently occurring type manufactured during the Chalcolithic period was, of course, the famous cruciform figure. Cruciforms occur as larger scale figures in pottery and stone, but more often as small pendants with drill holes on top for stringing onto necklaces. Most are made of picrolite, which occur as pebbles in riverbeds such as the Chorus and the Lumata, and also as thin seams in the serpentinite rocks of the Troodos near Kato Amiandos. In 1992, Eddie Peltenberg proposed the idea that cruciform pendants are small, schematized versions of the larger birthing figures referred to in the previous slide. The depiction of these objects around the necks of some of the larger examples, such as the Yalia figure shown here, as well as wear marks in drill holes on the pendants, suggests that some of them may have been worn in life before being deposited in graves, and may therefore have served as personal identity markers that accompany their owners throughout the life course. It's also possible that the cruciform type evolved from ambiguous or dual-sex prototypes known from the Neolithic period, the late Neolithic period, as Eddy proposed in 1982. So you see, you begin up here in the late Neolithic, and gradually there's an evolution in the early Chalcolithic in the 4th millennium, and then into the 3rd millennium, where the type gets more and more, you can say sharply defined, perhaps is the best way, but less ambiguous, perhaps, and more sharply defined, more detailed. Taken together, the evidence of Chalcolithic figurines and pendants points to a fluid, non-binary system of gender involving the display of small pendants as individual markers of identity and the use of larger figurines in a variety of communal life cycle rituals. Now, the tradition of figurative art in Cyprus, centered on the production of cruciforms, persisted for more than 1,000 years, culminating in the widespread production of figurines and pendants in the late 4th millennium. But strangely, these iconic images disappear from the archaeological record shortly after 3000 BC. Apart from a few unprovenanced examples, figurative art begins to reappear only at the end of the early Bronze Age, around 2000 BC, when new types of anthropomorphic imagery occur in great numbers in the large communal cemeteries along the north coast. These plank figures bear no formal or stylistic resemblance to their Chalcolithic predecessors and are associated with entirely different stratigraphic and socioeconomic contexts. So for the remainder of this paper, I'd like to examine some of the reasons for the decline of Chalcolithic figurative art and, by association, the system of personal and social identity it represented. Specifically, I wish to address the following points. First of all, why are the vast majority of figurines and pendants found at Souskiou intact, while most examples from Lemba and Kasonaga appear to have been deliberately broken? Secondly, why did the long tradition of anthropomorphic figurine production on the island come to an end during the late Chalcolithic period, and what replaced it? Thirdly, in what ways can changes in figurative repertoires and the gender-related traditions they embodied be linked to the reemergence of cross-cultural interaction between Cyprus and the mainland from the late 4th millennium onwards? And finally, in what ways does a multi-scalar approach enable us to understand changes in gender and other forms of social identity in greater depth and detail? So, that's a tall order, and don't expect I'm going to have full answers to all of these questions. Right. One of the most interesting features of anthropomorphic figurines and pendants at the sites under consideration is evidence of their deliberate fragmentation. The majority of examples from Lemba and Kasonaga, for example, are broken in places that would not break naturally or by accident, and on many there is evidence for intentional scoring prior to breakage. This phenomenon is attested most vividly at Kasonaga Mosfilia, where 19 stone and 10 ceramic figurines were deliberately defaced and broken and deposited into a pit in what appears to have been part of a ceremonial act. The broken fragments were placed in and around a ceramic building model that was also deliberately damaged. As you can see here, this decoration has been deliberately gouged away. And the entire set was buried and covered with broken pottery vessels. The remains of animal bones and other burnt debris are additional features of this pit that attest to its special ritual character. Radiocarbon evidence dates the pit to the end of the 4th millennium, shortly after which the production of anthropomorphic imagery at the site ceases entirely. The deliberate breakage observed on the figurines in the Kasonaga deposit and on the majority of figurines and pendants elsewhere at the site is a practice that occurs also on most of the figurines at neighboring Lemba Lakus. A very different pattern, however, can be observed on figurines and pendants from the extramural cemeteries of Souskiou, where despite extensive looting in modern times, the majority of examples recovered are intact or only slightly damaged. a comparative study of figurative material at all three sites, done in 2011 by an Edinburgh student, Bertu Keane, clearly demonstrates the differences. While the vast majority of examples at Lemba and the two sites at Kasonaga, so that's Mosfilia but also Miluthkia, were deliberately broken, 78, or that's 85%, of the total of 92 examples from the Vatakakas Cemetery 1 were intact. So it's really quite a substantial distinction. Here you see the very small numbers of complete figurines from these other sites, Mosfilia, Miluthkia, and Lemba, and so very small percentage, whereas at Vatakakas it's quite substantial. A detailed report on figurines and figurative objects from Laona is currently in preparation by Elizabeth Goring as part of the final publication of the site, and her observations are likely to confirm the pattern observed by Bertu Keane for the figurines and pendants from Vatakakas. Now, Suski is different from other chalcolithic sites in the region in other ways, as indicated by the results of our excavations there between 2001 and 2012 under the direction of Eddie. And just to give you some images for those of you that have not been to the site, on the left here we see an aerial view of the site and showing also at the top the necropolis. That's the what we call Operation C, or the Suski-Laona Cemetery. This was the cemetery across the ravine at Vatakakas, and sorry, that was here. I got my glasses. And this is the settlement. This is the Laona settlement. And just to show you from a different perspective, slightly perhaps more comprehensive, you can't see the Laona cemetery here, but you see the three operations. Those are all within the settlement, and the Vatakakas cemetery across the Vatakakas ravine on the other side. And note too the erosion of the buildings at the settlement. We actually expected to find much less than we did, but you can see here in Operation D, the front halves of all the buildings have more or less eroded away down the steep, precipitous slope, and actually made excavation quite scary at times. In terms of chronology, there are two basic phases that have been identified. Harlambos is doing the chronology. He managed to learn Bayesian modeling in the middle of everything else. And so we have an early phase and a late phase. And the early phase is dating to the last centuries, as you can see here, of the 4th millennium, and period 2 then clustering within the early centuries of the 3rd. So other differences, well, in contrast to the small intramural pits burials found at Lemba and Kasonaga that I showed you before, which contained very few artifacts, most burials at Suski, or at least those that were not looted, comprise large bell-shaped structures with a rich variety of grave goods, mostly cruciform figurines and pendants, and a lot of dentalia. But so this is from the publication of Vatakakas, and you can see here, this is a typical set of figurines, pendants, dentalia, shells, and on this side, some of the pottery vessels, some wonderful pottery vessels that were uncovered. And also from Laona, and this is a little taste of what's to come in the publication. This is just a small sample of the figurative material that's come out of Laona, mostly from the tombs. So quite spectacular. Okay. Now, in contrast to the objects, which, as I've shown, were mostly intact despite extensive looting activities at the site, the human remains within the tombs were systematically carved up and disarticulated, as you can perhaps appreciate on this slide, with long bones grouped together in stacks at the base of the tomb and skulls placed in a row on top. This new type of burial regime allowed for multiple interments within a single structure. As many as 14 individuals have been counted by Kirsty Lorenz, who's doing the human remains, in one case. Although in many cases the final burial was placed into the tomb in a fully articulated state. This unusual treatment of the dead, which has not been recorded elsewhere in Cyprus, shifts the focus of mortuary practices from the individual to the communal group and suggests significant changes involving the evolution of kinship groups linked to common ancestors, developments that are key to understanding the changes in personal and social identity that were beginning to take place at this time. In contrast to Suskiu, which was abandoned in the early 3rd millennium, occupation at Lemba continued into the late Chalcolithic period, so maybe several centuries later, while at Kosonaga it persisted until the Philia phase of the early Bronze Age, so about the middle of the millennium. Anthropomorphic figures and pendants have not been found in late Chalcolithic contexts at those sites, that is at Kosonaga and Lemba, although picrolite pendants in other forms, non-anthropomorphic forms, that is, continued to be produced during the late Chalcolithic. This was followed by a 500-year hiatus when anthropomorphic imagery on the island all but disappeared. In its place, there emerged at various stages from the late 4th millennium onwards new types of personal ornamentation that were either imported or influenced from foreign sources. The earliest of these are faience beads that resemble known types from Syria. About 30 examples, I think 29 to be exact, have been recovered from our recent excavations at Laona, all from mortuary contexts. So that means all are period 1. These are all from the late 4th millennium. Right? 7 examples of this same type were also recovered in excavations at Suski Vathirkakas, and given that these sites were heavily looted, there are likely to have been many more. Recent XRF analyses by Lina Kassianidou and Andreas Haralambos have been conducted on these beads and will be published as a chapter in the final site report, which we hope will appear next year. The faience beads from Laona, which date to the second half of the 4th millennium, are the earliest recorded in Cyprus and perhaps in the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole. 3 of the Laona beads and 4 from neighboring Vathirkakas have significant quantities of tin in their glazes, indicating either that the beads themselves were imported from abroad or that they utilized scale from alloyed copper metal, which must also have come from a foreign source. Equally important are the analyses by Lina and Andreas of metal artifacts from late Chalcolithic contexts at Lemba and Kosonaga. I'll be getting to those in a second. These are obviously middle. Some of which have yielded evidence of copper with traces of tin that are high enough to be regarded as bronze rather than copper. These objects, too, should be regarded as foreign imports, demonstrating conclusively for the first time the occurrence of bronze in Cyprus during the Chalcolithic period, well before the start of the Bronze Age. Now, just to sort of leave the script for a minute, and because I know there are a few people who are metallurgists in the audience who are very interested in metallurgy, but just to run through these objects, the objects along this one is these are all from Middle Chalcolithic date. This is a shell with malachite from Kosonaga, but it's from a period 3A grave, so that makes it period 3A is early in the Middle Chalcolithic, so before 3000 BC. These 3 objects are from Erimi, and this one was published by Dikios as a hook, but actually when we have examined it again in light of these kinds of beads that we've been finding at the Suskiu sites, it doesn't have a sharp barbed end. It wouldn't have served very well as a hook, and its undulating surface sort of suggests that it too may have been a spiral from a spacer bead that may have been unraveled. This one is sort of the only outlier. This is tin bronze. Noel Gale analyzed this some years ago. Dikios didn't publish it in the Arimi report, and so we do wonder in the end why didn't he put it in? The other 2 were in there. It was mentioned in his day book, but he didn't actually decide to publish it. So did it come from a context that he thought was sort of spurious? I really don't know. Anyway, and then these are all from Suskiu Vathirkakas, that one, but the rest of them are from Suskiu Laona. And anyway, notice that the point I'm trying to make here is that most of them are copper, with the exception of that. They're all copper. There's no evidence for any tin in these. And also that with the exception again of perhaps of the chisel, which is a tool, most of these early ornaments, granted it's only very few that we have to deal with, but most of these early objects are ornaments and they are not tools. Whereas when we move to the late Chalco, notice the difference. Most of them are tools. The only one that's not a tool, this is a transitional period 4/5, sort of philia, ear or hair ring from a late grave, so it's probably best viewed in a philia context. But all the others are either evidence of metalworking, so bits of perhaps copper that were being worked at the site. This crucible that's been published, that's well known, and then these chisels, one from Lemba, but the rest of all these other ones are from Kasonaga. And the three that I've circled in red actually have tin in their content. 5 and 7 only, 2 and 5 only smallish percentages, but number 7 actually has more than 3% tin. That means it has to be bronze, has to be considered bronze. So we do have bronze in the Chalcolithic. So I think this for me is the most exciting part of my talk. I think this is new stuff that we didn't know before. So this is really quite something. So, as argued by Eddie in a volume in honor of Jim Yulee published in 2011, the change in metal usage from personal ornaments to functional tools during the late Chalcolithic is not coincidental and should be viewed as part of the major social and ideological changes that occurred in Cyprus early in the 3rd millennium. Disc-type beads made of faience, shown in the middle here, with numerous parallels in southeast Anatolia and the Levant, were found in late Chalcolithic burials at Kasonaga. And Kasonaga has also yielded examples of another personal ornament with probable foreign connections. Those are the spurred annular pendants manufactured in shell and picrolite, shown here on the top left. Similar ring-shaped pendants are common in the Levant and southeast Anatolia. Here it shows you, the little red dots show you some of the distribution places where they've been just found. At sites such as Tel Bia in Syria and Hachanebi in Turkey. And precursors dating to the 4th and 3rd millennia are found across the Aegean and Anatolia. The Cypriot version adopted by late Chalcolithic groups in the southwest of the island was adapted to the medium of shell, so that the bar of Circum-Aegean examples, shown at the top, became a spur in Cyprus, and this is repeated in picrolite examples as well. While annular pendants continued to be used in Cyprus during the Philia phase of the early Bronze Age, their origins in the late Chalcolithic period suggest that it cannot be merely interpreted as a marker of Philia identity, as has sometimes been argued. And just to show quickly the stratification of these items at Kasonaga Mosfilia, we have within the late Chalcolithic these three buildings superimposed on one another, and in the lower two, 3 and 706, there were annular pendants, but no red polished philia, whereas in building 86 above, where there were traces of philia, there were actually no annular pendants. So anyway, it just shows you the stratigraphic relationship that we found at that site. At Kasonaga, faience beads and annular pendants coincide with the introduction of chamber tombs, a development that is also likely to have been introduced from abroad, perhaps from Syria, where similar tomb types are known to occur at a number of 3rd millennium sites. All but one contain multiple burials, mostly of adults, and all lack anthropomorphic imagery. New types of monochrome pottery from these tombs show influence from Anatolia, but these should be regarded as foreign-inspired rather than imports, since they're manufactured in standard late Chalcolithic fabrics from locally available clays. In contrast, we have the situation at Lemba, where the pit grave tradition persisted into the late Chalcolithic period, although some burials were placed farther away from buildings than had previously been the case. Chamber tombs were not adopted here, and there were no faience beads or annular pendants, suggesting a significantly lower level of foreign cultural interaction than seen at Kasonaga. However, the occurrence of relief decoration on pottery vessels, including a fragmentary face pot shown on the top left of this slide, and spouted bottles with long vertical relief bands shown on the bottom left, both with parallels in Western Anatolia, as shown on the maps to the right, as well as a fragmentary copper-based object, LL209, bearing traces of tin, which, and again, Lena and Andreas have also analyzed that one recently, suggests that Lemba was not entirely sidelined from these developments. But unlike Kasonorga, where habitation continued into the beginning of the early Bronze Age, Lemba was abandoned during the late Chalcolithic period following the destruction of several buildings by fire. And some of the buildings shown on the left, and on the right you see some experimental work that was carried out by Gordon Thomas and some students a few years back, where they deliberately destroyed a Chalcolithic roundhouse. It's quite dramatic. Anyway, this suggests that interactions between Cypriot and mainland communities during the first half of the early third millennium may not always have been peaceful occurrences. As a consequence of renewed interaction with other regions of the East Mediterranean in the late 4th millennium, Chalcolithic communities in Cyprus began to abandon traditional forms of personal and social identity and adopt new types of ornaments and cultural practices from abroad. These and other related factors are likely to have altered the fluid system of gender that characterized the earlier phases of the Chalcolithic period. And the deliberate breakage of gendered objects in the Kasonorga ceremonial deposit attests to this phenomenon quite dramatically, marking an end to a system of personal and social identity that had prevailed on the island for more than half a millennium. What replaced it? I wish I could answer this question, but it's difficult because most phases of the early Bronze Age, sites of most phases from the early Bronze Age are almost entirely lacking in representational art, and its reemergence at the end of the third millennium occurs within a completely different framework of social, political, and economic circumstances. What is clear, however, is that Cypriot communities began to reconstruct their identities as they became re-engaged with the surrounding mainland, and that this phenomenon began to emerge during the early centuries of the third millennium BC, or even one could argue the end of the 4th millennium now. Settlement evidence from excavations at Mosphilia, at Marchialonia, Sotira Kamanudia, as well as the results of recent surveys in many regions of the island and the refinement of radiocarbon dates allows us to shift our research focus from questions of when and where to questions of how and why. Evidence from Marquis leaves little doubt that the transition from Chalcolithic to the Bronze Age involved the arrival of migratory groups from southwestern Anatolia. While the evidence does not support a simplistic invasion theory that neglects the significance of internal developments on the island, it does support the view, argued forcefully by Frankel and Jenny Webb, that during the later third millennium, indigenous communities, whether eagerly, unwillingly, or inadvertently, shared their terrain with foreigners, or in some cases, may have been forced to abandon their centuries-old settlements. And the political, social, and economic changes that ensued profoundly transformed the island's traditional habitus. And while migrations to and to Cyprus from Anatolia and the Levant may have occurred more regularly during the second half of the third millennium, these episodes should not be viewed as a short-lived series of events, but as a result of long-term cultural processes spanning the entire third millennium. Distinguishing between events and processes allows us to move from historically based, descriptive models of culture change to more socially based models involving issues of identity, ethnicity, agency, and acculturation. In order to understand the particular processes that were involved in the cultural transformations of the Middle and Late Chalcolithic periods, we need to consider the nature of the social interactions between native and migrant groups. In particular, we need to ask whether processes of acculturation and assimilation were unilateral or bidirectional, whether changes in material culture and behavior exercised a uniform impact on indigenous communities around the island, and why the change from Chalcolithic to Bronze happened when and where it did. To that end, it is important to understand the means by which traditional Chalcolithic cultures of Cyprus became integrated into a larger socioeconomic sphere, a process that has been characterized aptly by David Frankel as becoming Bronze Age. The complex issues surrounding the political, social, and economic development of Cyprus from the Chalcolithic to the Bronze Age have been addressed in a recent doctoral dissertation by Haralambos Paraskeva, who is with us tonight, in an in-depth review of all the evidence and mindful of its limitations. Harry has adopted what he calls a post-paradigmatic position, a wonderfully alliterative phrase that suitably reflects the complexity of the data. Drawing upon a range of chronological and material evidence, he argues for increasing regional and local divergence, as well as incipient levels of social stratification among the island's communities toward the end of the Middle Chalcolithic period. During the Late Chalcolithic period, this tendency became more pronounced, resulting in sharper boundaries between different regions of the island, higher levels of socioeconomic complexity, and the disintegration of the cultural homogeneity characteristic of earlier periods. The Late Chalcolithic also marks the renewal on a slightly wider scale of contact with the surrounding mainland, in particular Anatolia, but also the Levant, interactions that antedate the arrival of migrant groups and the destruction and abandonment of indigenous Chalcolithic settlements during the early phases of the Bronze Age. Harry concludes, and I quote, that there is a more complex array of responses and reactions to the arrival of new populations on the island than assumed up to now, which requires a more nuanced reading of the data and a re-examination of their interpretations. This is a perspective that is fully endorsed by me here. In the recent book, The Body and History, John Robb and Oliver Harris adopt a multi-scalar approach to the body and identity that is extremely relevant to the arguments I'm proposing here today for the Chalcolithic of Cyprus. Drawing on detailed evidence for diachronic changes in body worlds, what they call body worlds, from the Paleolithic period to the present, they identify a number of distinguishing features for the Neolithic societies of Europe and Southwest Asia. These include a focus on ancestors, as single burials around houses and sites become the norm and skulls are reused in rituals, the emergence of new relationships between bodies and places, in particular the use of burial as a vehicle for forging relationships with specific places and preserving the memory of the collective body of the group rather than the individual. An explosion in material culture related to the creation of the social body through artifacts such as ornaments, clothing, and other types of bodily decoration, and the dominance of the human figure in art. While many of the figurines that they cite in this book for the Neolithic are clearly female, others are ambiguously gendered, suggesting a fluidity of gender constructs. So in many respects, the concept of the Neolithic body world, as articulated by Robb and Harris, can be applied to much of the Chalcolithic period of Cyprus as well, with the succeeding cultures of the Cypriot Bronze Age marked by a similar decline in figurative art, the rise of weaponry and metal artifacts in graves, and the possible emergence of less fluid forms of gendered identities. Macro-scale perspectives are important for understanding long-term changes in gender regimes, but they cannot by themselves account for the variable and complex processes which those changes entailed. It is therefore important to consider evidence from specific sites that contravene the general trend. Robb and Harris, for example, use evidence from the Neolithic sites of Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük to show that at some sites in Anatolia, wild animals continued to serve as a source of symbolic potency, a feature normally associated with the Upper Paleolithic period. For Chalcolithic Cyprus, I have attempted to demonstrate the variable means by which contemporary communities transformed their personal and social identities during the early part of the third millennium. Figurative art provides one avenue for exploring these changes, as does evidence of other forms of material culture such as ceramics, metallurgy, personal ornaments, and the deliberate fragmentation of human bodies in the Siskiyou cemeteries. In Cyprus, practices of fragmentation linked to changes in gender identities can now be traced to the second half of the 4th millennium, well before the start of the early Bronze Age. By investigating these changes at multiple scales, and by drawing upon a broad range of evidence, we can begin to appreciate the multiplicity of processes by which Chalcolithic communities abandoned their traditional configurations of personal and social identity and reconstructed themselves along radically different lines as they became engaged in a larger, more complex world. And I'd like to conclude, well, with two things, but first, this quote from Cyprian Brubank's Tour de Force, Making of the Middle Sea, which I've just been reading, but the sentences from that book really sum up, I think, very nicely some of the central themes I've been trying to focus on today. So just to read it out, the ancient Mediterranean as a human world was not a given, but came into being as a consequence of activities over time. In this sense, it was long in the process of becoming. Such Mediterraneanization was therefore a dynamic process. It necessarily involved change, often conflictual, as a place of mobility, encounter, and flux. The early Mediterranean constitutes an instructive, even guardedly hopeful place to study the world. I certainly have found it a wonderful place to study the world over the last 30-some-odd years. And thank you very much. And in closing, I'd like to especially thank the team of Suskia Laona, who we've been hard at work trying to get the publication together. And there are 24 of us all together, so it's quite a large group. And several of them, Lindy's here tonight, I see Harry's here tonight, Lena's here, and some of the others are on the island but weren't able to make it. Paul Croft, unfortunately, is just recuperating from hip replacement surgery in the UK, so he couldn't make it. But in any case, we would all, I think on behalf of the entire team, I'd like to pay a special tribute to Eddie for his outstanding contributions to Cypriot prehistory, which will continue to have a tremendous impact on all of us in the years to come. Thanks very much.
Is it working? Huh?
Hello, Rania. You make it.
Yes, I made it, and I came. Yes. Congratulations, and thank you very, very much for presenting us such a wonderful panorama of the Middle and the Late Chalcolithic in Cyprus, and for pointing to all these changes that were gradually taken place on the island. Congratulations also to the entire team who is working under the shadow of Eddie and is going to complete soon the work he has started.
And just to add to that, I'm always hearing in my inner ear saying, "Get on with it! Stop faffing about!"
Yes. So, I assume that after this holistic presentation of the later phases of the Chalcolithic on Cyprus, there would be some questions to Diane. Who wants to start?
Or perhaps for Lena, because I think the centerpiece of this paper was about her chapter on metalwork.
But I would like to ask something else. Yeah. Why this differences, this contrast between Lemba and Kisonerga, which are so close together? Do you think is a difference in period, or is it two different? I mean, you have different barrier customs.
No, they're absolutely contemporary in the late Chalcolithic period. So it's just that's what I think is very interesting. Is that what we've been arguing is that looking at the micro scale, you start to see that even though they're of the same period and of the same in the same place, really just a couple of kilometers, practically spitting distance apart. They show really, even though generally you could lump them together, but I think the trend today is to start looking at at evidence from the bottom up and not try to lump everything together. And we do see these distinctions between different sites. Suski is dramatic, but you would think in the Katima lowlands where the other sites are. And now Chloricus is being excavated, so who knows what surprises are going to be there, and whether that'll be even a different trajectory of developments when the Leiden team is managing to publish some of that stuff as well. So yeah, it is odd.
Jenny Webb.
Thank you, Diane. Is it working? I wanted to ask you how you fit into your scenario of the influence from outside, the pottery, the evidence from political kokinorodsos for the use of relief decoration, which actually predates your examples, as I understand it, at Lemba and.
Yeah, well,
is that evidence for earlier contact?
Yeah, well, maybe it's evidence that even perhaps earlier than the 4th millennium. I mean, you're saying it's earlier, it's a Middle Chalcolithic, but it wouldn't be surprising in the sense that we're starting to get this evidence now of faience and metal objects showing clear context between Cyprus and points elsewhere. So why not relief decoration at Kokkinorotos? I mean, that would be another example, I would think, even though we know, because we took out the pottery a few years ago, we see that in many respects you would give it a different label, and you have, but in terms of the relief decoration, I could see that this is part of that larger phenomenon as well. So I have no problem with that.
Thank you for this fine lecture.
It's not working.
Thank you for the. No. So. We know that the Chalcolithic period is in a very limited part of Cyprus.
Yes. Well.
This is given. And it's given also that the Bronze Age, the early Middle Bronze Age, is much more homogeneous and it covers much more part of the island. So according to that, or given that we have this archaeological evidence, do you think that maybe, I want your idea, that maybe this Chalcolithic period is only limited in the certain area of Western Cyprus and is made by a group of people that they came here?
Well, I mean, first of all, I should say that Haralambos' thesis, he went back to the Cyprus survey collection, and he's looked at a lot of pottery from sites from Catling's survey that we were unable to excavate, but I mean the ceramics will indicate that there were quite a number of sites in the north that can be considered to be late Chalcolithic. Unfortunately, we can't excavate them, and who knows when we'll be able to. But in addition, we have, it's not just the southwest. I mean, I focused on that because that's what I know the best, but we do have Kokkinorotos, we do have Ambelikou, we do have Kalavasos. We do know something of the Chalcolithic, obviously not as much because part of it is that there hasn't been such an intensive research focus on it, except for by Eddie. But it's also part that we would expect that there would be quite a number of sites to explore in the north of the island, but until the situation changes, we're not going to really be able to do more than talk about survey pottery, which obviously is going to have its limitations.
So we have to wait for more.
We have to wait for the old story. We have to wait for a political change.
I have another comment.
Okay.
You show a sitting figurine of clay,
Mm-hmm.
and I think this figurine is not so sure that it's sitting.
Which one are you referring to from the Perides collection? Yes. The male seated. Yeah, it's allegedly from Suskiu. And it's actually not a figurine, it's a vessel. Some of those things are actually open vessels, yeah. Yes, allegedly from, I should have been more careful in saying allegedly from Suskiu. Thank you.
Are there more questions? I wanted to ask you something regarding the good presentation. You pointed to the better preservation of figurines and pendants from picrolite in the cemeteries of Suskew. Based on what has been published on the nature of the settlement of Suskew, there we had these workshops that were producing all this material for being used in the graves. And this settlement of Suskew was very limited. Okay. On the contrary, in Lemba and also in Kisonerga, they were found broken or very used, abused, etc. Don't you think that this has to do with, could have to do with the previous use of these artifacts in the settlement before they were given as burial gifts, speaking in...
No, I see your point. I think that also, though, when they occur in burials, they're also broken. So in other words, they've been deposited. And like the ceremonial deposit, which is not a burial, but it's a kind of a ritual burial of these objects, were clearly deliberately broken. And at Vathakakos, it seems that they weren't. Now, I'd like to say about this that the work that's been done so far was very much a pilot study, and the work that Bertrude Keane did in 2011 was done prior to, well, we were excavating Laona, but she wasn't allowed to look at that. So, and also she was, she didn't have tons of experience looking at this stuff, so she had her criteria for deciding what was deliberate and what wasn't, but we have to consider it a pilot study. But one of the things that Elizabeth and Gorian and I would like to do, because it does seem to have a gendered connection, we'd like to do after we publish Laona, is there will be life after Laona. But after we publish Laona, one of the things we'd like to do would be to go systematically through a lot of this material, go back through what she did, but also include the Laona material and see whether we come up with the same kinds of results. So I think I have to say at the moment that what I've said about this is probably, it should be regarded as provisional. Provisional, yeah, yeah.
Are there more questions? If not, I want to thank you very much once again, and to say that next semester we are going to have one lecture by Harry Paraskeva, who is going to present the results of his PhD. And also another lecture by Bleda During, who is going to present us the excavation, the current excavation at Chloraka. We're waiting for the final publication. This would be an opus magnum. I wish you all the best until its publication. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Grania. Thank you.
in my traveling around the Mediterranean, I photographed sails, pendants, in Bulgaria, in Salonico, in Gaul. Maybe. But because they appear almost in the same way. So in the archer of the third millennium, it may be that something happened. There is a meaning.
Where are these things found? Because it really is some ideas about how to interpret them. And I don't think that contextual study has been done yet. I think that's why I think there's a good PhD there.
We don't find only in one material. Starting from gold, big one and Salonico. And doing it, you find even in different kinds of stones in Palestine.
Expanded